Athens lay beneath a bruised sky, its marble pillars glowing in the fading light of a world about to end. Smoke curled over the rooftops, and the sound of distant marching echoed like thunder rolling across the plains of Greece. The year was 480 BC, and the greatest city of men stood on the brink of destruction. The Persian Empire, vast and merciless, advanced upon it like an unending tide, commanded by Xerxes, king of kings. To the world, Athens was doomed, but to one man, it was merely the opening move in a game no one else could see. Themistocles stood upon the high cliffs overlooking the harbor, the wind tearing at his cloak, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He was not a man of noble birth, not a king or a god favored by Olympus. He was a thinker, a strategist, a man who understood that wars were not won by strength alone but by vision. Long before the Persians marched, he had seen this day coming. He had persuaded Athens to build ships instead of statues, fleets instead of temples. Others called him paranoid. Now their fate depended on his madness. The enemy was too powerful to face on land. Xerxes' armies moved like an ocean of iron, swallowing everything before them. Resistance would mean annihilation. Yet Themistocles did not fear destruction. He understood sacrifice. A city could burn, but a civilization could endure if its people lived to fight another day. So he made the most audacious decision in Greek history. He ordered the evacuation of Athens. Families abandoned their homes, carrying what they could. Women and children were ferried to the islands of Salamis and Troezen, while men prepared to take to the sea. The streets, once filled with laughter and philosophy, now echoed with the cries of farewell. Even the sacred relics of the gods were taken from their altars. It was not cowardice, it was survival, crafted by the mind of a man who knew that the soul of Athens did not lie in its stones, but in its people. When the last boats departed, silence fell upon the city. Themistocles remained behind with a few chosen men, watching as the smoke of torched houses began to drift skyward. To the Persians it would appear as surrender. To him it was deception. He was burning Athens not in defeat but in defiance. Every flame was a message written in smoke, a message that the real battle had yet to begin. As night fell, the fire consumed the heart of Greece. The temples cracked, the streets glowed red, and the Acropolis itself seemed to weep molten tears. Yet amid that inferno, Themistocles did not look away. He whispered to the wind that the Persians had taken a city of ashes, but the spirit of Athens now sailed upon the sea, waiting, watching, and preparing for vengeance. The Persians came like a storm the next morning. Their banners stretched across the hills, gold and crimson shimmering in the dawn light. Xerxes himself rode among them, towering above his men, confident, unstoppable. When he entered Athens, he found no defenders waiting, only silence and the stench of smoke. The streets were deserted, the hearth still warm as if the people had vanished into thin air. To him it was victory. To Themistocles it was bait. Xerxes ordered the city to be burned as tribute to his triumph. Flames climbed the marble steps of the Parthenon, curling around columns that had stood for generations. Statues shattered, temples turned to molten ruin. The sky grew black, and from across the straits of Salamis the refugees watched their homes dissolve into ash. Some wept, others cursed the gods. But Themistocles stood among them, face set like stone, eyes reflecting the fire. He told them quietly that this was not the end. It was the opening act. He had already begun his next move. While the Persians reveled in victory, Themistocles sent a secret messenger, a slave named Sisinus, to Xerxes' camp under the cover of night. The letter he carried was a lie wrapped in truth. It claimed that the Greek alliance was falling apart, that Themistocles himself wished to join Persia's side, if only Xerxes would strike quickly before the Greeks could escape. The Persian king, hungry for an easy triumph, believed every word. As the messenger disappeared into the darkness, Themistocles turned to his captains and spoke of the narrow straits of Salamis. There, he said, the gods would decide Greece's fate. The Persians, with their vast fleet, would be trapped in waters too tight for their numbers. Their advantage would become their downfall. The other commanders doubted him, calling it madness to challenge an empire at sea. But he answered calmly, "Madness is the name the fearful give to genius before it wins." Through the night, preparations began. Greek ships, Sleek, narrow triremes lined the shores like a wall of shadows. The rowers oiled their benches, whispered prayers to Poseidon, and stared at the stars, knowing that by dawn many of them would not live to see another sunrise. Themistocles walked among them, speaking little, but each man who met his eyes felt his courage rise. There was something unshakable in him, as if the sea itself had chosen him as its general. In the Persian camp, celebration turned to overconfidence. Xerxes ordered his massive fleet to block both ends of the strait, certain that the Greeks would try to flee before morning. He would crush them in their retreat, he thought. But Themistocles had no intention of fleeing. He wanted the Persians exactly where they were, trapped, proud, and blind to the storm waiting in the mist. As the first light crept across the horizon, the winds shifted. The sea lay still, waiting. Oars dipped into the water one by one, hundreds of them slicing the surface with quiet rhythm. Themistocles stood at the prow of his ship, cloak whipping in the breeze, eyes locked on the enemy's massive line of ships that filled the strait like a forest of masts. The trap had been set. Now came the moment to spring it. Dawn broke over Salamis like a blade. The sun slipped above the horizon, igniting the mist that hung over the strait. Greek triremes glided silently through the pale light, their bronze rams gleaming beneath the surface. Rowers whispered prayers to the sea gods, fingers trembling on oars slick with sweat and salt. On the far side, the Persian fleet waited, vast, proud, and already doomed, though they did not know it yet. Themistocles gave the signal. A trumpet cried out over the still water, and the sound cut through the fog like thunder. In an instant, hundreds of oars struck the sea together, driving the Greek ships forward with terrifying precision. The Persians, caught off guard, scrambled to form lines. Their commanders shouted orders in a dozen languages, their ships colliding in panic as they tried to maneuver in the narrow channel. The sea that had seemed endless suddenly felt like a cage. From the cliffs of Mount Aigaleos, Xerxes watched from a golden throne, expecting spectacle, not slaughter. At first he smiled. He saw his ships advancing, glittering under the sun, and believed the Greeks were cornered. But soon that smile vanished. Themistocles' plan had sprung to life. The narrow straits forced the massive Persian fleet into chaos. Their size, once their strength, became their weakness. Their oars tangled, their hulls crashed, and in the confusion the Greeks struck. The first impact came with a sickening crunch. Athenian triremes rammed into the flanks of Persian ships, splintering their hulls like dry wood. Water rushed in, dragging men and weapons down in seconds. Themistocles' rowers reversed, pulled free, and struck again. Every motion was practiced, every strike deliberate. They had no numbers, but they had precision and rage. For every home burned in Athens, for every statue turned to ash, they fought with vengeance in their hearts. The battle turned the strait into a graveyard. Persian archers loosed arrows blindly into the smoke, striking their own men more than the enemy. Greek hoplites leapt from deck to deck, swords flashing, shields splintered. The sea ran red, but still Themistocles urged his men forward. He knew this was not just a fight for Athens. It was for Greece itself, for every city that dared to call itself free. As the hours passed, the chaos deepened. Persian ships, trapped and burning, tried to retreat, but the exits were blocked by their own fleet. Greek triremes moved like hunters among wounded prey, ramming, boarding, burning. The cries of men and the clash of oars echoed off the cliffs. Themistocles' flagship cut through the carnage, his face streaked with ash, his voice carrying over the din. "Hold the line. The sea is ours." By midday, the outcome was certain. Persian ships sank one after another, their decks collapsing beneath the weight of panic and fire. Xerxes watched, his throne trembling with each defeat. His messengers returned pale, speechless, their reports little more than gasps of disbelief. The fleet that had once darkened the sea was now broken, torn apart by cunning, courage, and a commander who saw victory not in strength, but in strategy. When the last Persian banner vanished beneath the waves, the strait fell silent. Smoke curled into the sky, carrying the smell of salt, ash, and victory. Themistocles stood at the prow once more, staring at the horizon where the enemy had fled. He said nothing. The battle had spoken for him. Greece had survived, not through walls or wealth, but through wit and will. The sea was quiet now, broken only by the creak of oars and the drift of burned timbers. What had once been the mightiest armada in history was scattered wreckage, floating proof that cunning could break empires. Themistocles stood on the deck, his face lit by the dim glow of embers still flickering on the horizon. He watched as the last of Xerxes' ships vanished into the haze, retreating toward Asia. The silence felt heavier than the battle itself. Around him, exhausted sailors stared across the water in disbelief. Some cheered. Others simply collapsed where they stood, their arms trembling from hours at the oar. For weeks they had feared this day would mark the end of Athens. Instead, it marked the birth of something new. The city had burned, yes, but from its ashes a legend was rising. Themistocles looked down at the sea and whispered to himself, "We traded marble for tomorrow." News spread quickly. Across the islands and the mainland, word of the victory raced like wildfire. Messengers ran through camps shouting, "The Persians are broken! The sea belongs to Greece." Refugees on Salamis wept, not from sorrow this time, but from relief. Mothers held their children tighter, and old men who had believed they would never see their homes again fell to their knees in gratitude. Athens might still be in ruins, but the spirit of its people had never stood taller. In the Persian camp, chaos reigned. Xerxes had watched the battle from his throne, confident it would be a spectacle of triumph. Instead, it became a humiliation so profound it echoed through centuries. His advisors urged him to withdraw before winter, and revolt tore his empire apart. The great king, who had once commanded half the known world, now fled across the same bridges he had built in arrogance, the bridges Themistocles had always planned to make his prison. For Greece, the victory at Salamis was not just a naval triumph. It was proof that freedom could stand against tyranny, that wit and unity could outweigh numbers and gold. Themistocles became the hero of the hour. In every port, sailors toasted his name. Poets began composing songs about the man who had tricked a god-king. Even those who had once mocked him for his audacity now called him savior. Yet beneath the praise, Themistocles knew what the victory truly meant. The war was not over. Persia would return. Themistocles used the moment wisely. He urged the Greek alliance to stay united, to fortify, to rebuild. He argued that the walls of Athens should no longer be made of stone alone, but of ships, hundreds of them. As long as we rule the sea, he said, no army can touch our soil. Many laughed. But they had laughed before, and Themistocles had been right every time. When the survivors finally rode home, the sight waiting for them was hard to bear. Athens was little more than rubble and smoke. Temples lay cracked open, their statues shattered and blackened by fire. The air smelled of dust and salt and ghosts. Yet Themistocles did not mourn. He ordered the people to gather what they could and begin anew. The gods have burned our city, he told them, so that we may build it stronger. In the years that followed, Athens rose again, not just as a city, but as an idea. Its people poured their pain into art, philosophy, and democracy. From the ruins came beauty, and from loss came wisdom. Themistocles' gamble had not only saved Greece, it had set in motion the birth of Western civilization itself. And though he would later fall to politics and exile, as visionaries often do, history would not forget him. Every harbor, every ship, every debate that shaped Athens carried his legacy. Because in the moment when all seemed lost, he had dared to see through the smoke and find victory within defeat. When the waves of Salamis finally calmed, they carried with them more than the wreckage of war. They carried the sound of a new world being born, a world where courage was cleverness, and fire could become strategy. Themistocles had taught the world a truth that still endures. Sometimes the only way to save what you love is to let it burn and begin again. Years passed, but the echoes of Salamis never faded. The sea that once carried fear now carried trade, ideas, and pride. Athens rose from its ashes like a living myth, each street a testament to resilience. New marble replaced the old, temples gleamed again under the sun, and laughter returned to the agora. What had been a city of refugees became the beating heart of a new world, a world of thinkers, builders and dreamers who owed their future to one man's impossible gamble. Themistocles watched this rebirth with quiet satisfaction. He walked through markets rebuilt from the dust, hearing merchants call out prices, Children play near fountains, and scholars argue beneath the olive trees. Every sound was proof that his risk had not been madness. Athens had not just survived. It had transformed. The smoke that once rose from its ruins had become the incense of civilization. Yet he also knew that victory came with a price. Power once earned attracts envy. In time, politics turned sharp again. Rivals whispered that Themistocles sought to make himself king. Jealousy, that oldest poison, crept through the assembly. The same people who once cheered his name now debated his downfall. It's a pattern as old as humanity itself. The savior of one crisis becomes the scapegoat of the next. When the accusations grew too heavy, Themistocles chose exile over disgrace. But even in foreign lands, his mind remained anchored to the sea he once commanded. He traveled east through lands that had once trembled at his strategy. In a twist of fate only history could write, he found refuge under the very empire he had defeated, Persia. There even his enemies recognized his brilliance. The great king himself welcomed him, not as a captive, but as an equal. They say that when Themistocles stood before the Persian court, he looked into the eyes of those he had once deceived and smiled. Because true power lies not in armies, but in intellect. Back in Greece, Athens continued to flourish. The city grew into a beacon of philosophy, art, and science. Pericles would rise, Socrates would question, and the Parthenon would pierce the sky, all built on the foundation Themistocles had laid. His vision of Athens as a naval and cultural powerhouse had taken root. Even those who cursed his name lived within the safety his foresight had bought. Every trireme that sailed, every debate that echoed in the Knicks, was part of his silent legacy. History tends to remember kings and conquerors, but Themistocles was something rarer, a man who saw beyond the horizon. He understood that true strength isn't the power to destroy, but the wisdom to choose when to sacrifice. The fire that consumed Athens wasn't ruin. It was rebirth. Through that inferno, he transformed defeat into destiny. The story of Salamis wasn't just about ships and strategy. It was about belief, courage, and the willingness to lose everything for the greater good. As years turned to centuries, poets and historians kept his memory alive. Plays were written, festivals held, and sailors still whispered his name before heading into battle. He who commands the sea commands all, they said, his words echoing through time like a prophecy fulfilled. Themistocles had proven that brilliance could outshine brute force, and that even in ashes, greatness can take root. And maybe that's the lasting truth of his story. Sometimes the bravest act isn't to fight harder, but to think differently. To look at a burning city and see not the end, but the beginning. To let go of comfort for the sake of something eternal. That is what Themistocles gave the world. A blueprint for resilience, for daring, for vision that stretches beyond the moment's fear. The waves of Salamis still lap against the shores of history, whispering his lesson to anyone willing to listen. Empires rise and fall, but the courage to imagine beyond destruction endures. Themistocles proved that one mind, sharpened by purpose, can shift the course of civilizations. And so, when we look back across the millennia at that smoke-covered sea, we don't just see ships and fire. We see the birth of an idea, that strategy can save freedom, and that sometimes you must burn the present to secure the future. Themistocles knew it. History remembers it, and the world still sails in the wake of his wisdom.